Daddy Squared, the Gay Dad podcast with Alex Megan and Jan Megan.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Daddy Square, the Gay Dads podcast. I'm Jan.
I'm Alex.
And Alex, I know you don't like to talk before we introduce our guests and
It
co-hosts.
just seems so rude. They're sitting here. They're just sitting here.
We have two co-hosts today. Good morning, Stephen and Spencer.
Good morning.
Oh my God, I love it. It's just like
There was a
the
little
gay man's
harmony.
chorus.
Yeah.
We didn't plan that.
Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourselves?
Well, I'm Steven, and I am originally from Ohio. Been in LA for about 4 years now. I do talent and organizational development for a biotech company based in Culver City. And Spencer and I have been together now for about 2 years.
Yay.
Where did you meet? Or how?
We met through a mutual contact. It was really by chance. We probably
Synchronicity.
wouldn't have met otherwise, but yeah, we happened to meet by chance.
It was a school night.
5 hours later, we were still chatting.
So are you married?
We are engaged.
Oh, that's wonderful.
We both want 2 kids, so it's kind of a good match for us.
Yeah.
All right. You know,
How about you?
I am originally from Utah. I'm third of 7 children. I moved to Los Angeles 17 years ago. I grew
So
up.
he's a native.
Yeah, so this is home now.
Well, yeah, does 17 years counteract Utah completely, or is there still a little Utah left, or what?
Not much, Utah was such a great place to get a foundational basis, and then I think I spent years sort of having a very contrasted experience from what I grew up with and realigning with what feels right with my soul. So there's a lot of good I took from it, but also some things I had to leave behind.
Right.
And I love my family. They're great people. They're very accepting, and I'm happy to be in a city that helps me thrive. And I'm a very creative person. I grew up acting, and music was a huge part of my life. And I attended film school, moved to LA, and started pitching TV, and kind of picked up some side jobs doing makeup for celebrities, and that's continued now for 17 years. And had some other interesting phases. I had a 7-year dual career as an interior designer. And now I focus on.
Now you're an exterior designer.
Yeah. Now I continue doing makeup, but I launched a beauty and skincare line maybe 18 months ago with some business partners, and that's been going very well. And,
The name of which is?
Spencer Barnes LA,
All right.
which is my Instagram name. So
Awesome.
yeah, life is very exciting, and I also write and produce music. That's another passion
Oh, wow.
project of mine.
So what I'm hearing you say is there's not much going on in your lives, both of you. So
Boring lives.
why not have children?
We can't keep him still.
I know. I'm like, we got to figure this out.
And that's what we're here for. We're going to help Stephen and Spencer find out more about surrogacy today. We interviewed Dr. John Hesla from ORM Fertility. He's a board-certified reproductive endocrinologist.
All right.
Did I say it right?
Yeah, I was hoping that we were going to get a nice blooper reel out of your attempt to say endocrinologist, but damn it.
Who had helped build one of the first embryology laboratory clean rooms in the world. He's internationally recognized for his innovative methods for IVF treatments.
I think it's so nice that he created a clean room for IVF. Our children were made in
Filthy.
a laundry room or something like that. It's obvious
Turkey-based.
from the way they conduct themselves that it wasn't a clean room.
Daddy Squared.
Before we go to the interview, I want to talk to you guys, and especially to you, Alex, about the morning routine.
Okay.
Because there's a phase, and I don't know, like you guys are, you don't have kids yet, but you will face these problems where every morning one of our kids doesn't want to go to school.
Yeah.
And that starts a cycle of meltdown. Sometimes it's infectious.
Yep.
Alex and I are both like helpless. We don't know what to do about it.
Well, so we've learned some things. One thing is, for example, that they need to wake up early enough before the time that you depart for school, because you can't wake them up or have them wake up by themselves, 20 minutes before you put their clothes on and push them out the door. They will lose their mind.
I'm the same way.
Right. I mean, right. I mean, I think it's kind of human, right? So that's one. Two, we discovered something very important, at least about one of our kids, which is an early sugar spike in the morning is a bad thing. I always assumed, it'll help them get going. It's a bad thing because when they get to school, at least one of them would, lose his mind. So there's that. But then beyond that, we have not figured out what the moods are, what causes these things to happen. I thought maybe what if they got a bad
Okay,
night's
let's pose
sleep?
this question to you guys.
Yes.
Now, let's say you guys are about to go to work. You have a client, Spencer, and just go to work. And one of the kids doesn't want to go to school. And it's like 20 minutes to the time when you are supposed to go. What would you do?
I don't know. I'm an emotional, sentimental person, and I would feel that feeling. And I would probably just work from home that day and just, okay, let's just stay home for the day.
It's funny. It's funny because that sounds like it's not the right answer to the question, but I think it depends on why and under what circumstances you choose to do that. It might make sense, right?
Yeah.
I do think that so. As the guy in the couple, this is Alex, who
Is it?
Yeah, who has the most difficult time saying no and sticking to it. I would say that there's a huge long-term impact, and it is that even though it just seems like it's in one area and it's not a problem, they develop an understanding of who you are and what they're going to be able to do with you through things that don't even seem like they're that big a deal. And the next thing you know, you can't get anything done with them because they look at you and they say, oh, you're the one who will stay home with me all day rather than, just say, no, you're going to school.
I can manipulate you. Yeah.
They are masters. I mean, they will find and listen, I have a theory as to why everyone says, well, children, why are they so brilliant at manipulation? It actually makes perfect sense. It's all they are there to do right now. At this age, our kids are 4. At 2 and 3 and 4, their entire lives is negotiation. It's I want this,
Coming up with ways to get what they want.
Right, because ultimately that's all that they're working on in their lives. They're not also writing an opera at the same time or anything like that, or, going to their job. All they're doing is saying, how can I get what I want? And learning what will work and what won't.
One of my favorite studies is a team of experts that wanted to find out how to first find children that could be sort of negotiated with into giving up something they want right now to get something doubly good later.
Yes.
The marshmallow study. So they were told if they waited for up to so many minutes, they could have 2 marshmallows. But if they wanted only 1 marshmallow, they could have it right now, and that's all they would get. So I've thought about that often and wondered when we have children, how we will use reason and negotiation to set up rewards for and find things they actually want that we can use to work with them. I have a client who's got a young one right now, and we worked on a show called Flirty Dancing. So she had several mornings where there were meltdowns. She's also a mother who's recently gone through a divorce, and now there's a wonderful new man in her life, and they're preparing for baby number 2.
Right.
So it's been interesting watching her some days. She's like Stephen probably melts her heart when her little girl has a meltdown, and so they've had to learn how to negotiate with her to get her to go to school.
The marshmallow thing is really, it's an art. I mean, you have to, once you get the idea.
And here's the thing, just the marshmallow experiment by itself won't really get you anywhere. So we've done it. We've tried this thing, not per se with marshmallows necessarily, but with we're at the store. You can get this mediocre thing that you've been asking for in the store now, or you cannot get it. And when we get home, we're going to give you, whatever, something amazing. And one of them says, no, I want this thing now, right? The problem is, one, that then when you get home and they want the much bigger thing, you can't cave in. You absolutely, under no circumstances, can cave in. I'm saying this, by the way, to myself because I'm the one who caves in. But then the other thing is, then you have to do it again, and you have to do it again soon. Because the first time around, they don't make the connection that that's really what happened. So then if the next day or even later in that day you find another way to do a marshmallow type situation, then they're going to start understanding that pattern, which is waiting might get me something better. I don't know that we've accomplished that yet, and I'm not entirely sure that children at certain ages are even capable of it yet.
Yeah, I feel there needs to be a healthy balance. Like, I don't think children should always hear the word no, because as they're growing up, then they feel like they're unworthy of having things if they're constantly being told no. And then you have these, I guess like teenage adult issues that, they're trying to recover from.
Right, or they become automata, which you don't want that to happen.
Right,
and then they end up going to Yale, which just nobody wants.
If you guys have any recommendations for us, or just want to share your stories of how do you get your kids to school in the morning when they don't want to, please write to us at hello@daddysqr.com or on Facebook at Daddy Squared.
I'm working on a catapult that will just fling them.
All right, let's go to the interview now. Alex, do you want to read the proof? The truth? The
proof?
The truth?
What the hell are you
forgot the
saying?
word.
Okay.
I just forgot. Read it. Just read it.
I'll read the thing. Daddy Squared, the Gay Dads Podcast, Season 3, is sponsored by Love is Family by ORM Fertility, your gateway to fatherhood. Research begins at loveisfamily.com.
Yes, and there's some new articles this week on loveisfamily.com. If you guys are looking to have kids, all sorts of researches and interesting articles. What happened? I don't know. Right.
Dr. Hesla?
Hi, doctor.
Hello.
Good morning.
All right, so we're all here.
We're here with Stephen.
Good morning.
And Spencer.
Hi there. How are you?
Hi, Stephen and Spencer.
So why don't you start with a description of how it goes? Like, what does it mean?
If they came and visited you.
Okay. They would need to make some decisions regarding how they want to create their family. There are different options, of course. In some couples, only one man will provide sperm, whereas in other couples, both men will provide sperm to create embryos so that they could each be genetic fathers. They would need to select an egg donor either through a clinic or through an egg donor agency, or they may need to reach out to a friend to ask a friend to be an egg donor. And then they would also be partnering with a surrogate to carry the baby for them. So they may find a surrogate through a surrogacy agency, or perhaps a friend will volunteer to be a surrogate for them, a friend or a relative. That's not as common as finding a surrogate through an agency, but we often help men who have a friend or a family member who's willing to carry a pregnancy for them.
Yeah, we're hoping to take some friends as volunteer as tribune for the surrogacy, but we'll see when that time comes.
Yeah, we're open to learning as much as we can about all the different ways, some of the things to expect, the pros and cons, the cost, some of the maybe.
What are some of the pros and cons of going with someone that you know, a friend, as an egg donor?
Well, generally, if it's someone you know, the expectation is that person will have a role in the child's life. So your child would know that she was the donor, and that probably your child would periodically see her, and she might play a special role in your child's life. Egg donors that are anonymous or semi-anonymous would not have that same role, although you might be able to meet them and your future child may be able to meet them, but there generally wouldn't be likely to be a very close connection over time.
This is Alex. When we did our kids, we did not go with an egg donor who we knew. And I think one of the factors was that the agency provided egg donors who were already had all kinds of physical checks and background checks and all of this stuff that meant that we were most likely to, I guess, have success. And so when you bring somebody who is a friend or an acquaintance, she may be very willing, but that doesn't necessarily mean that she has, the right setup physically for this to work out right. Correct?
That's true. Certainly, donors that apply to our clinic, for example, to donate undergo a very vigorous screening process. And only about 7% of the women who apply to be donors actually are accepted and go through the process. Whereas if a friend or a family member agrees to donate for you, she may not be optimal in terms of her egg quality or in terms of her family's medical background. So if the woman who is the donor is someone the couple knows who volunteers to be a donor, she would need to undergo a very thorough screening process. But for example, sometimes we'll have sisters donate for couples, and I've treated donors who've been as old as 40 and 41 who have been sisters of one of the men in the couple, and the treatment has worked, but the chance of it working is much less if the egg donor is older, just because there's much higher rates of genetically abnormal eggs.
And this not being Game of Thrones, obviously it will be the spouse of the person whose sister is donating the eggs.
Correct. Of course, yes. Yes, that's true.
And,
yes.
And I have a question about the surrogate. So the surrogate is the same way? I mean, let's say that the couple say this woman is willing to carry our embryos. What do you do in order to make sure that it's potentially a success?
We would first obtain the medical records of the potential surrogates' past pregnancies and deliveries and review them to make sure that there were no complications in previous pregnancies. All surrogates are women who've had children in the past and who have children who are living at home with them.
Is that your policy as an organization, or is that some kind of a regulation or something?
That would be part of the guidelines for practice that our medical society has issued. So we would never treat a woman as a surrogate who's never delivered a baby in the past because she's not gone through pregnancy and delivery. So it would be certainly more difficult for her to give consent because she doesn't know what she's really
signing up for,
going to go through. And there are potential risks of women carrying pregnancies, and we want to make sure that a surrogate is someone who would have a low-risk pregnancy.
So from start to finish, what is kind of the timeline going through this process?
Usually it takes, I would say, about 9 months to treat the egg donor and surrogate. And one of the reasons why I would use that as a figure is that often it takes a few weeks or months to be matched with a surrogate, for a couple to be matched with a surrogate. And then the pregnancy itself takes 9 months. So it's about a year and a half from starting the process to when the baby is born.
And again, because this is new to us, is this something that is covered through any sort of medical insurance, or how does that process work? Because I know some states do.
More and more men have insurance plans that may cover part of the process. So it's something that the fertility clinic would evaluate. But the total cost can be quite high just because if the couple is using a compensated egg donor, an egg donor who's being paid to donate her eggs, and a surrogate who's being paid to carry the pregnancy, the cost can add up to $150,000 in some cases, or even more, depending upon who the egg donor and who the surrogate is.
When we did this 4 years ago, our surrogate had health insurance, and her health insurance covered
She
her.
had Obamacare?
Yes, she had Obamacare, and even if she had not, her husband had family health insurance, and she was covered for her pregnancy for us. But I have heard, and Doctor, I don't know if you've heard about this, that in some states or some insurance companies, they have specifically carved out coverage for a woman's pregnancy when she's doing it for somebody else. Is that the case? Have you heard about this?
Yes, a lot of insurance plans have done that. So the surrogacy agency would evaluate the surrogate's insurance coverage, and if there is not coverage through her personal plan, then generally the surrogacy agency would help arrange through an insurance broker for the surrogate to have a plan that would cover obstetrical care, and the intended parents would have to pay for that plan. Often the plans that are purchased for surrogate pregnancies come through the Affordable Care Act, Obama's healthcare plan.
Very interesting. As we've started talking about this more seriously, we've had a number of girlfriends who have stepped forward, even without even knowing that we're considering this, offering either eggs or to be a surrogate for us. Many of them have not had children. So in that kind of a case, if it's a girlfriend who comes forward, what would be the risks with that, and would it even be a viable option?
Oh, it's certainly possible for a friend of yours to donate eggs to you. There's no requirement that the egg donor have had a pregnancy in the past, although the egg donor will be screened to evaluate her egg quality and egg numbers, and she'll undergo some genetic tests to make sure that she's a good genetic match for the couple or the single man who's having children through this process. With people who volunteer to be surrogates, we would evaluate their uterus to make sure it's healthy. So she would have an ultrasound study. We certainly, of course, also perform infectious disease tests to screen for diseases.
Sure.
The surrogate and the egg donor is screened by a psychologist to make sure that she has a suitable psychological health, psychological background to be an egg donor or a surrogate. The legal steps in determining that the child is the offspring of the intended parents is usually quite straightforward in most states. So quite often the attorney will go before the court, before the baby is born, to get a declaration from the judge that the baby is the baby of the future parents and not the baby of the surrogate. So once the baby is born, it's immediately recognized legally as the child of the parents. And generally, in most states, both men can be put on the birth certificate, if it's a male couple, as the fathers of the child.
One other question while we're kind of on this topic. I've had friends who have done the surrogacy route. One of my friend couples, they tried twice and both of those embryos failed. I was curious, how many eggs does it usually are collected with, to be made as viable embryos? And for another thing that I've encountered more commonly is gay couples that want to have kids, and so they often end up having twins. To make it a little bit of an easier process having them together, probably a little harder that first year, but we've considered that, and interestingly enough, have had several intuitives say there's twins in the future, so I don't know.
Oh, really?
I love that.
We'll leave it to a possibility, but is it usually a chance, like let's say you plant 3 viable embryos and one takes, what are the chances and how many viable embryos are usually implanted for two to end up holding and developing into full term?
It would be very, very unusual to place more than 2 embryos into the uterus of a surrogate.
Yeah, we don't need Octomom again.
Yeah. So generally, the choice or the decision is whether one embryo or two embryos should be placed. In more and more cases, we're transferring a single embryo just because twins do have a higher risk of complications,
Sure.
A higher risk of prematurity. There's a greater chance that the surrogate would need a cesarean section. But the choice is ultimately the choice of the intended parents and the surrogate. Pregnancy rate and live birth rate is higher if two embryos are placed as compared to one. For example, in our program, if we transfer one embryo, the live birth rate is 68%, and the chance of identical twins is 1.5%. So an embryo can split into two embryos after it's been placed in the uterus. And if we transfer two embryos, the live birth rate has been 86%. And 65% of the surrogates deliver twins if we transfer two embryos. So the twin rate is very high. Wow. There's even about a 1% chance of triplets if we transfer two embryos, because again, an embryo can split into two embryos. And that would be considered a very high-risk pregnancy.
Right.
One of the things, doctor, that please correct me if I have this wrong, is when I talk to straight couples who have gone through IVF, the stats that they provide are much, much lower. But I think that the reason for that is because they're going through IVF because they've had trouble, because it's been difficult. And in this case, when we're doing IVF for a gay couple with a surrogate and an egg donor, the surrogate and egg donor are usually in prime physical health in order to get this right the first time. So the likelihood that everything's going to go smoothly is actually much, much higher in that situation than when a woman is having trouble getting pregnant, and so they do IVF and all of that kind of stuff. Do I have that right?
Yes, I would say that is correct, in that the egg donor and the surrogate are women who have optimal fertility, and the men who are planning their family through egg donation and surrogacy usually have normal sperm quality. So no one in the process is infertile. So the chance of success is very high.
Right.
One of the questions you asked earlier is how many embryos normally will grow from one egg collection. And if we look at our clinic's data, the average number of mature eggs that we collect from a donor is 22. Wow. And out of that group of eggs, the average fertilization rate is between 70 and 75%. So some of the eggs that we collect may not fertilize. Then we'll let the embryo grow in the laboratory for 5 to 6 days. And during that time, the embryo should divide many times the cells of the embryo, so that when the embryo is 5 or 6 days old, it should have more than 100 cells inside of it. Only about half of the eggs that fertilize will grow into an advanced embryo. So some of the eggs that fertilize will lead to embryos that stop growing when they're 2 or 3 days old. So we always expect to have a lower number of usable embryos than the number of eggs we start with. So, for example, if we have 18 or 19 eggs that fertilize, the average number of embryos that reach the blastocyst stage, which is the medical term for an embryo with more than 100 cells, is around 9.7 in our program. And then it's become quite common to biopsy embryos to analyze the chromosomes before the embryo is placed in the surrogate's uterus. And we can safely remove about 5 cells from the future placenta and do genetic tests to determine if the cells that we've biopsied have 46 chromosomes, the correct number, or if they have an extra chromosome or a missing chromosome. And when we do that sort of testing, what we find is that about 2/3 of the embryos that we test have normal chromosomes, and about 1/3 of the embryos that look normal microscopically are actually genetically abnormal. This sort of testing gives us more insights as to which embryos we should use first.
Is that as far as it goes? I mean, I remember that in our case they did more than a chromosome count. They did some genetic testing beyond that. Is that Is that happening commonly?
The main screening that's done of embryos is analyzing the chromosomes through sequencing to look to see if there's any additional DNA or missing DNA in the chromosomes. It is also possible to test the embryos or to test the man providing sperm and the woman providing eggs to determine if there would be a risk of an embryo or a future child with a genetic disease like cystic fibrosis, where there's only a very small mutation in DNA. But most men don't have that risk. But we would do a blood test on the sperm provider and on the egg provider to determine if there are carriers for about 280 rare genetic diseases to make sure that there's an appropriate match of the egg donor and the sperm provider.
Very cool. So also, while we're on this talk about the early stages, what goes into gender selection if the couple desires to determine the sex of their child, or let's say if they want to have twins and they want a boy and a girl, how is that done, and at what stage in the process is that determined?
So that's done through biopsying the embryo at the blastocyst stage when the embryo has more than 100 cells. At that stage of development, we can tell clearly which cells will form part of the placenta, and they're called the trophectoderm cells, and which of the cells inside the embryo will form the baby. The cells are removed, the DNA is analyzed, each chromosome is tested. So we do test and find if the embryo contains an X and an X chromosome, which would lead to a girl, or an X and a Y chromosome that would lead to a boy.
Of course, there's this other factor, which is, I don't know what the terminology is that was used, but effectively the quality of the embryos, right? You can have viable embryos, but there are better viable embryos in terms of likelihood to make it through pregnancy and less viable. Is that the case?
Yes, that's correct. There's two ways of assessing the potential of the embryo when it reaches day 5 or day 6 of growth. One is the genetics, but also very importantly is the appearance of the cells under the microscope. So the embryologist will give the embryo a grade based on how the cells appear. For example, there's a grading scale where the cells that form the baby are graded. They're given a grade of A, B, or C, and the cells that will form the placenta are graded based on their microscopic appearance, and they're given a grade of A, B, or C. So the embryologist would prefer to pick an AA embryo for transfer over a BB embryo. Although BB embryos can lead to babies as well, but their chance might be somewhat less.
Right. So if a couple really wanted a girl and there was an AA boy embryo, male embryo, and a BB female embryo, would you strongly advise?
I'll actually give you an example. This is a true story. There was a very nice couple that I was helping who live in France, and they were planning on having their children through egg donation and surrogacy. And they went through this treatment process, and they ended up with 8 genetically normal embryos. 7 of their embryos were male, and 1 embryo was female. The female embryo was a grade BB. All of the male embryos happened to be grade AA. And so after we got the results back from the genetics laboratory, I spoke with them and reviewed the results with them. And we talked about which embryo they would want to use. They did tell me that they wanted to have more than 1 child. But what they decided was to transfer the female embryo first. They knew that the female embryo potentially had a lower chance of leading to a pregnancy, but they felt that they should give the female embryo a chance. So we transferred the embryo, and they had a beautiful daughter. Then, to complete the story, they went through a second treatment with the same surrogate. The surrogate agreed to carry another baby for them, which was wonderful. And we transferred one of the male embryos, and they ended up having identical twin sons.
Wow. Actually, I wanted to ask you, going back to what you were saying before about twins. We have IVF twins from 4 years ago. Is that since then there seems to be a little bit of a shift in the way the medical profession is viewing implanting two embryos in this kind of situation, meaning doctors have a tendency to be discouraging it. Is that the case because risks are higher, et cetera?
I think that doctors across the country are encouraging single embryo transfers because the pregnancy rate is actually very high with a single transfer. The risks are lower. The main concern with twins, even in cases where surrogates had normal pregnancies in the past, normal single fetus pregnancies, is that with twins there's certainly a significantly greater risk of premature delivery. The average time when twins are born in the United States is when the woman is 35 weeks pregnant, which means that in that case the babies would be born about 2 or 3 weeks premature. And about 15% of twins are born before 32 weeks. And for very premature babies, they generally do well, but they have to spend a prolonged time in the neonatal intensive care unit. And then there are some increased risks of health problems in premature babies, very premature babies.
Have you ever looked for a woman who's had twins successfully? Do they view her as, for a couple that is considering twins, do they view her as a more viable host for twins, or is that not a factor that's ever really been studied?
I would say if that's a very good question. I think if a woman has carried twins successfully in the past without any complications, that's a very positive sign for carrying twins again. Not very many women who've carried twins in the past necessarily are volunteering to carry twins again.
Yeah. Gee, I wonder why.
Yeah, so I don't know. I mean, you could look for someone with that background, but you might have to look a while before you find someone who who has that history.
Look, I think one of the considerations that is no joke is that having twins, not only through birth, but actually to some extent afterwards, is cheaper. It's not so during the overall surrogacy, IVF and surrogacy process. I don't know how much it saved us, but it probably saved us a significant amount of money. One, we paid our surrogate more because it was twins, but not double, right? There were a lot of reasons why I think that couples can look at this and say, well, it's not two for the price of one, but it's cheaper than doing two completely separate pregnancies. So,
it's also for don't forget the age. Like, we can't wait too long.
Right. Some of us are old, and we say, I want to do this, and if I'm going to have more than one child, I'd like to have them very, very soon. So, what is your when people come to you and say, listen, I need to save money by having twins? If they do come to you and say that, what do you say?
Well, it's not half the price, of course, just because there are some costs that are higher with twin pregnancies. For example, the surrogate usually receives a higher compensation for carrying twins, and she would receive a higher compensation normally if she delivers by cesarean section. It is true that if a U.S. citizen or a resident of the United States who has U.S. health insurance goes through this process, their personal health insurance will extend to their offspring, to their children when their children are born. So if the babies are born early, the parents' health insurance plan would cover most, hopefully all, but certainly most of the medical care that premature child may need. For some of the patients that we help who are not living in the United States, the risk of very high medical bills for premature twins really prevents most of them from transferring two embryos because they cannot accept the risk of having to pay for all the medical costs of premature babies, which could be hundreds of thousands of dollars if twins are born, for example, before 30 weeks.
Right.
So with the costs associated, within the last decade, like how many gay parents would you say have had gone through this process to have children?
Oh gosh, that's a good question. I was looking at data from U.S. data from 2017, and their clinics in the United States submit the results of their treatments to the CDC and to our medical society, which is called SART. And the outcome data is available on the internet. So potential patients can look at different clinics and compare their results, and also look at national data by looking at these two websites. And in 2017, there were about 1,000 donor egg surrogacy treatments where a single embryo transfer was placed. So that gives you some idea. And I think that was data where the embryos had been biopsied, which most of the couples now that we're helping, or single men, are choosing to have their embryos biopsied, but not all. The percent, though, has certainly increased of patients that we're helping and cycles that we're doing for gay men is certainly much higher now than it was 15 years ago, just because there's a lot more media focus on the fact that this is a very effective way to help men become fathers.
But you see this more so in single men versus couples? Is that what you said?
No, I would say we see it more in couples than single men, but we certainly I help a lot of single men as well become fathers through this process.
Tell us a little bit more about when you have collected a number of viable embryos. Is it common for the couples that are setting up the surrogacy to have those cryogenically preserved in case they want to have additional children? Is that the time you do that, or do you go through a new process when they're ready to have more children, if that's a choice they make?
Well, usually the treatment results in many embryos that potentially could be preserved for the future. So embryos can be frozen very effectively, and once they're frozen, they don't change over time. So men can have a second or third child from embryos that had been frozen 3, 4, 5 years or even longer in the past. And the success rate should be the same with those embryos. So again, in our program, the average number of genetically normal embryos that we have from one treatment, this is in cases where we biopsied embryos, is 6.8, so approximately 7. And that having 7 embryos is usually enough for at least 2 children, and probably more likely 3 or 4, considering the success rates that we've achieved. So sometimes men will actually have more embryos frozen than they actually ever need to use. And if they have extra embryos and they've completed their family, then they'll have to decide if they would want to donate their embryos to someone else or donate them for a research study performed by a research laboratory, or if they would want the clinic to discard their extra embryos.
Fascinating. We have 2 friends that actually went that route. They saved their other viable embryos. They had a child. They were thrilled with the process, and a year later decided to have what they thought would be a second child, but they had twins. So now they have 3 children. So it's fun to see how things turn out. Would you tell us a little bit about preparing for the possibility of things not to work out, or for disappointment? another couple friends that we have had two surrogates and both failed, and they spent quite a bit of money. So they ended up adopting. Tell us a little bit about your experience with that and how to prepare people for that possibility and what the statistics are, I guess, for the likeliness of that to happen.
That's very sad. It does occasionally happen. It's generally more likely to occur due to a low number of embryos rather than an issue, a problem, potential problem with the surrogate. But occasionally men need to switch surrogates because during the treatment process, there are rare cases where we'll learn that the surrogate's uterus is not quite as ideal as we would have expected. Most men will achieve a pregnancy within 2 transfers, but a lot of clinics now will have financial plans where if the men run out of embryos, they can create additional embryos at a very, very reduced cost. There are some guarantee plans that are in existence that clinics may offer that can help if a pregnancy doesn't occur with the initial group of embryos that have been created. And similarly, if the future parent is working with a surrogacy agency and there isn't a pregnancy that's achieved within 2 or 3 embryo transfers, usually it's 3 embryo transfers, the surrogacy agency will match the couple with a new surrogate for a very, very reduced cost. Because the pregnancy rates are quite high with these treatments, we don't run into this problem very often, but we do occasionally have unfortunate outcomes. And, our goal is to really help our patients become parents. So we look at ways, we try to look outside the box in terms of ways to help if the unfortunate bad outcome should occur. But it's not very often where I see someone try to start the process who I think is ill-informed, just because there's a lot of education that clinics and surrogacy agencies give future parents to make sure that they understand the commitments and the cost. Yeah.
Dr. Hesla, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us.
We're delighted for your insights. Thank you.
Yeah, it was my pleasure. And thank you very much for inviting me to talk to you today.
And hopefully we work with you soon.
Okay, we're back from the interview. We're here in the studio with Spencer and Steven. Guys, you're very naturals in interviewing.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I talk to people every day on a constant, so I guess I'm naturally just...
You guys should have your own podcast, I'm telling you.
We toss around the idea from time to time. I don't, with everything that Spencer has going on, I'm like, I don't know that we should add another thing.
I'm not sure if you're aware, but
Kids and podcasts.
you should be aware you are the only 2 people who do not have a podcast.
I know. That's what we're told.
Anywhere.
You're nobody if you're not on a podcast.
Right. Dr. Hesla's voice was very sexy. You like that gravelly thing that he had going on.
Wait a minute. I wanted to just stop here on something. You guys said Intuitive told us that there are twins in the future, certain intuitives.
Yes.
Please tell us more about the intuitives.
It's funny. I have not always sought out intuitives, but they often find me at grocery stores, at gyms. They'll just come up to me and say,
At a red light.
Me,
No way.
Can I talk to you? I don't normally let them do this, but I've got someone here from your mother's side. She really wants to give a message, and they'll say
Who are
something.
they?
to
I want to
confirm it.
meet them.
Well, one of them you had on your show, Scott Cruz, actually.
Right.
He was
You're
at
kidding.
the gym, and he's like, you know what, I don't normally let them do this. And it was my grandmother who had recently passed who came through with some important messages for my mother. So I'm used to that. I don't know. I'm also quite intuitive, and it's been more so the last 4 to 5 years. And I think when I was younger, it would freak me out. I was like, there's no way I could know that. I felt like I was spying on people, or I would second guess it. But sometimes I get information. And so I've learned to just work with it and pass it if it feels like an important message for someone. And then, it's up to them to do what they want with it. But
so when you found out, when you heard that twins were in your future, who was it that was effectively telling you this? It's come from a few different sources. Really?
And I've had sort of, I don't know if you call it psychic dreams. They're a little different than just a regular dream, where there's that strong possibility, but that they would be fraternal, a boy and a girl. So.
Yeah, it's funny because a lot more lately, like this one and I have dreams that really coincide with one another.
Wow.
And I think around the same time that he had this dream, like mine are very vivid and colorful. So I actually had two specks of light that I saw in one of my dreams, a very strong blue light and then a very strong pink light.
Just for God's sake.
I couldn't make this up even if I wanted to. And they were just, floating around in dream space. So, they're always open to interpretation, but
wow.
Yeah.
Love it.
Well, you guys can actually just make it happen.
Yeah.
I mean, we could, yes.
So you know what? So an interesting thing that happened during the interview is the direction of the friends. We didn't really talk about that on our podcast before, like having a friend be the egg donor or the surrogate.
We've mentioned it once or twice.
Do you
So
guys
this is something you guys are looking at?
Yeah. It's a strong possibility. I think there's this fascination, especially when you're gay and you have girlfriends. They're like, oh my God, I want to have your kid, So you take it with a grain of salt, but, now that we're considering this, it's like, wait, well, maybe we should, if these people are truly serious about wanting to do this.
Well, and would you consider having a friend do both roles, egg donor and surrogate, or would you want to split that out?
I would be open to it. Would depend on who it is and really the situation.
I mean, let's just cut to it for a minute. Despite the fact that there may be some risks associated with it, it's also infinitely cheaper because you're dodging IVF altogether if you go with a woman who is also going to be the egg donor.
And we can just take them out to dinner instead.
Well, I mean, that's right. Just ply them with a glass of wine, and the next thing you know, they've got a baby.
Inside the dotted line.
Yeah, what's the problem?
We have one girlfriend who she's been married. She's not had any children, but she's sort of in that unique window where she's starting to go, okay, this needs to happen in the next so many years, or I might be past that window.
Right.
She's decided she doesn't need to be a mother per se, but she's wanted to say. She said to me, I'd really like to have my body fulfill its purpose and create a child.
Wow.
So if you guys are ever considering it, I would be open to that. So, I mean, there are certain scenarios, that doesn't happen every day, but that was what one friend offered.
Wow.
Are you open to share the child with a mother, or like a co-parenting, or do you want?
I don't necessarily know co-parenting. However, I would say it would be a nice idea to have this female figure,
as an aunt.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. I mean, I here's the thing. I think that this kind of co-parenting concept is fascinating, and I don't see a reason why it can't be made to work. I don't know that I would have been into it, but if our egg donor or our surrogate lived nearby and wanted to somehow be in our kids' lives, I would love that. I mean, I think that there's something very special about the relationship that she has with the kid, even if it's not being the mother.
Right. Sure.
Yeah. So I want to ask you, how long – so you guys have been together for 2 years?
Yes.
How long ago did you guys start talking about having kids?
I think when we first started dating, as everyone does, you talk about the
core values.
Exactly. So, knowing that both of us wanted children, we knew that early on. But I think fairly recently, within the last, 6-ish months, not to put timelines on ourselves, but we're like, okay, well, we're not getting any younger. Well,
no, I am.
I am, but but if this is something that we want to do, we need to look at our options, especially since it can be a lengthy process.
Yep.
Daddy, SQR.com.
Okay, one last thing that I wanted to talk about from the interview is about the frozen embryos. You know that there's an option to donate all the embryos that you don't use. And I don't know, what do you guys think about it? Because we didn't do it.
No, we
didn't.
did
I'll tell you why after.
So that's an interesting question, and I do have actually something I'd like to say about that. I have a large family. I have 17 nieces and nephews. My youngest sister, they're all married. My youngest sister, her husband had repeated bouts of cancer as a young person. He had leukemia, and all the years of radiation made him basically he's infertile. So they decided they were ready to start a family, and they worked with a surrogacy donor situation, and they found a viable match. So for them, they did work through a bank and used actually one of her eggs, but they looked at using embryos that were sort of stored and available. So it was interesting watching them kind of go back and forth and then ultimately come to a decision. But not everyone is. I think that case is more for a female who maybe isn't able to, for whatever reason, use her own eggs, or may have issues with her husband. Maybe they're not a match genetically. They might have children with disability,
Right.
birth defects and so on and so forth. So there are situations where that might be a good option.
Right, but let's say you guys go through the IVF process and you have a blue and a pink embryo, and you end up having a blue and a pink child, and you have 7 embryos left that you didn't use, and they say to you, would you like to donate those embryos for people who, for whatever reason, can't do this?
Yes.
Yeah.
So we said no, and I think that yes is wonderful, but I think I'm not
Why
sure
did you say? I want to tell you why.
Okay,
I
you
said-
go first.
Well, it was my genetics.
Oh, that's right.
It was
yours
it was
the
a
embryo.
girl.
That's right. Yeah.
In my genetics that we had one extra, and we said no. And the reason why is that I had dreams of her coming to me and saying to me, at a very older age, saying to me, why didn't you pick me? Why did you pick somebody else?
Why didn't you adopt?
And
Why did you adopt?
and because on a certain age they're allowed to know who their biological parents are.
Right.
And when she does, and she sees that I pick another child, it's going to be traumatic, I think. So I didn't want to face that.
Yeah.
It was purely selfish.
Sophie's choice.
Yeah, that's an interesting decision and a perspective too.
It's tough because on one hand, making embryos is really expensive, and it is a little sad that we had one and we didn't allow somebody else to take advantage of it who would otherwise not be able to afford doing this. So there is that. But I guess my
I
feeling
freaked
is,
out.
I
I
think
don't
that other than my husband's freak out, I think blood matters, and I guess. Were it entirely up to me, my concern would be that there is another kid running around with, my genetic material. I don't know who this kid is. For straight men, that probably happens plenty.
I was just about to say, I think that happens more often.
Right. But, as a gay man, I'm far more responsible than that. And I just felt like I would in some way always have a responsibility for that child. I would. And if that child ever, showed up on our front door, I would be like, okay, well, I got to deal with that now. So, yeah, I don't know. That was my thinking in a seemingly little selfish way.
Guys, thank you so much for joining us today. I would like to encourage our listeners to write to us if you have any comments or notes. Please continue to write to us. We received a lot of comments last week about the couples therapy. Alex?
Yeah.
People love when we share our problems. We share that we have problems.
Yeah. In the next episode, we're actually going
fight.
live. We're going live from couples therapy. That will not be happening because our couples therapist would never allow it, but I think it would be totally cool. And I would win that episode, totally.
You won last night.
Do you think I won last night's
did,
session?
yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Write to us at hello@daddysqr.com or leave us a message or text us at 213-793-8939. That's it for today.
Thanks,
Thank you,
guys.
guys.
Thank you guys for
Thank
coming.
you. See you next week.
If you're thinking about having kids, start your search at loveisfamily.com by ORM Fertility. For over 30 years, ORM Fertility has been at the forefront of fertility services, providing personalized care and helping all family types grow. ORM are honored to be a trusted resource for the gay community on their journey to parenthood and are now sharing all they know with you at loveisfamily.com. ORM's expert team gives gay parents-to-be all the information they need and guides them through their unique fertility journey, providing expertise, education, and support every step of the way. Over 1,000 gay couples and singles from all over the world have started or grown their family with ORM's support and fertility and financial expertise. Find out more at loveisfamily.com, ORM Fertility's online resource for gay dads and LGBTQ+ family building.
Daddy, that's QR.com.